scientific evidence now strongly supports the notion that tobacco addiction is a chronic relapsing medical condition. As a matter of fact, it's recognized as a chronic psychiatric condition in most of the global classification systems like the World Health Organization's ICD and the APA's DSM. So we know that tobacco addiction is already classified as a chronic disease, but what is the evidence for that? Based on what can we say that it's not simply a choice? We do know in the brain itself where nicotine works and where nicotine sits in order to exert its effect, there has been identified a very specific receptor complex. It's called the alpha-4 beta-2 nicotinic receptor. And it's specifically this receptor that serves as the binding spot for nicotine, and it has a high affinity for nicotine as well. So nicotine is attracted to that spot, and once two nicotine molecules bind to that spot, that is when nicotine can exert its effect, amongst others of which addiction is one. So tobacco smoke is inhaled, and tobacco smoke contains some 4,000 chemicals, of which nicotine is the main addictive compound. So it travels down the large airways into the lung, and it crosses into the bloodstream at a place called the terminal alveoli. It enters the bloodstream, and it now travels to all the organs in the body, gets pumped via the heart. In this case, the brain is the main target for nicotine, and nicotine, because it's such a small molecule, it crosses the blood-brain barrier very rapidly. And also because nicotine is free-based, because the tobacco industry adds ammonia to tobacco. The place where nicotine sits, we've mentioned, is the alpha-4 beta-2 nicotinic receptor, which is exactly what you see on the screen, these large complexes. And two nicotine molecules will bind to each one of those receptor complexes in order to generate what is called an action potential or an electrical impulse. Nicotine, after binding to the receptor, leads to a lot of complex changes on that receptor level, but the net effect is one of an electrical impulse that travels to a different part of the brain. And it's exactly that electrical impulse that now goes to what is called the reward pathway in the brain. That is the part of the brain that says, if stimulated, the smoker or the user will enjoy the sensation, enjoy the feeling, and a sense of reinforcement will occur. So dopamine, which is another chemical in the brain, gets released because of that action potential or the electrical impulse. And that is where the addictive nature of tobacco is executed. Nicotine is addictive because it releases dopamine in the reward pathway. In this case, when the reward pathway gets stimulated again and again, it becomes desensitized. And that's the phenomenon that we call tolerance. So people become accustomed to or tolerant to the effect, but if they abstain or they reduce the consumption, they will develop withdrawal symptoms. It's because of this principle. Also, these receptors actually change in numbers, so they tend to upregulate and they desensitize. It means more nicotine is needed to obtain the same effect, but also if nicotine is withheld, these particular receptor complexes will exert a certain effect, and that is what we speak about as withdrawal.